Today, we're going to be talking about a little denser emotion of grief. And in that process, it is a little bit challenging to navigate. However, there is a purpose to this. And so if you are experiencing that, I'll explain some potentials on as to why and some ways to navigate and move forward through it. So let's get into it. Welcome to the fourth episode of Ember in the Dark. I am your host, Mike Wharran, and today we're going to be diving in a little bit around the process of grief. And essentially, this whole dark space can be associated as a whole grieving process. I didn't realize that until, like I mentioned in episode 1, that a mentor of mine had pointed out. And once he had pointed that out towards me, that I had come to the fifth stage of grief, of acceptance, such that one can move forward, I was able to look back and be like, holy crap, I've been grieving this whole time. And I didn't know what I was grieving or who I was grieving. I mean, I've had people pass away in my life close to me, and yet I just had a deeper understanding that it wasn't the end, it was more of a transition. And so I never really felt that heavy grief. This was the first time I've ever really experienced it in my life in this last period. And what I would like to say as a potential in this process is you're grieving or potentially grieving your old self. The ways you were doing things that were ineffective by being sat down in front of this mirror and facing those challenges and those denser emotions of ways that, showing up that have been ineffective. Those habits, those behaviors is a version of self that is essentially no longer effective and ultimately in a death process. And so there is definitely some grief going through that. And so what my mentor had shared with me, the 5 steps of going through that is, the first one is denial. Okay. And, as the name implies, we deny we're in this process. We do anything to kind of figure out and get away from it, or renegotiate, which is the next step is negotiation. However, we deny it and we act as if nothing is really going on, which eventually transitions into a space of negotiation where we recognize that things haven't changed. They haven't gone back to a way or an effective way that we used to maybe distract ourselves with, or a way to navigate effectively like we have in the past. Again, using the analogy of that room shrinking down from 3,000 square feet to 100, and all of those denser energies and those things we've shunned away being right in the forefront of our experience. And so the distractions aren't working. They're not having the same effect in distracting effectively with ourselves. So then we get into a state of negotiation. What can I do? How can I negotiate my way out of this pain? Right. And once we realize there's not much negotiation, that's when we start to go into anger and we get mad at the choices. And you may have experienced this if there's some anger going on, and recognizing that if you look back over the period of time, however it's been for you, you may recognize that you may be sitting in one of these stages and recognizing there's a form of anger. Right. And so in my personal experience and my story, there was a good chunk of time where this denial of being in this dark space, this denial of this experience of being abandoned by God. And then eventually that transmuted into a stage of negotiation, in the sense of, what can I do now to get your favor back, God? What can I do now? What can I change now? And so a lot of my actions that I would change were to get back into God's grace. They weren't unconditional. They were forms of giving with a condition in hopes for a certain result that I was looking for at the end. And when those things didn't work out, then that's where the anger came out. And specifically, it was anger with myself, because I didn't act out or do what I felt like I was called to do at that time. And so there was a lot of anger towards myself, being an idiot for not following what I should have done. I should have did what I said I was going to do. I didn't do it. And, I had an opportunity and I didn't take the opportunity, whatever story. And there have been moments where there was anger towards God, and that's very normal in this space, right? That's very normal to have that anger towards God, source, whatever it is for you, because in this space, it place of, like I said, is allowing those emotions to clear out in previous episodes, right? And so part of that is anger. And anger is typically a mask or a cover up for fear, okay? And so if you have a lot of anger, it's typically a defense mechanism because we don't want to step into the fear that's underneath it. And what that fear is, that's unique for every individual. However, the anger is like the defense mechanism. And after the anger comes the depression, and essentially like a dip. We're going to go down into the bottom of the hole. And, for me, that's where life became Groundhog Day. There was nothing to be excited about. Even things in my kid's life or my wife's life that were exciting, I was unable to feel or be happy or proud of. I mean, I would put a smile on for them. However, internally, I felt dead inside. And so this depressive state is kind of like, some content online you may have seen. It's like depression is a form of compression, right? The seed is planted in darkness and it's compressed. Diamonds are made out of pressure. So it's kind of like a compression state that we're isolated in, such that we have the reflection and the insights of ourselves, the things that we know we can do better, the things we know we're avoiding, those challenges, those shifts in identity, beliefs, thought processes, habits, whatever it is for you, is all compressed into this such that it gets to a single point of power that, boom, you shoot out. Right? However, before we get into that stage, the fifth and final stage of the grief is the acceptance. And that's where I had this deep experience. So part of my journey over the last 5 years, 6 years involved some plant ceremonies, one of them specifically ayahuasca. And I've had great experiences with the medicine and, very deep healing processes and insights and awarenesses. And in this dark space, that was one of my go-tos in the sense of maybe this will fix me. Like I said, with the acupuncture and the Reiki and all those different modalities, being in this dark space, going into the medicine. Now, I wouldn't recommend that simply because the medicine is ultimately a magnifier. It does clean out the system, it helps regulate the nervous system. However, it also magnifies the experience that you're having currently and whatever's in the system. So if there is a lot of depression in the system, unfortunately, that can be magnified in the ceremony itself and can make it really hard for the body and the mind to settle down for the real work, the deeper work of the medicine to get through the system. And so I've had this experience. I attempted to go into the ceremony and the medicine when I was in the negotiation anger kind of stage of my grief. And the visual experience I had, it was like I was in a tube and kind of like looking across the tube. So down this way was one tube, down this way was the other end of the tube, and I was against the wall and looking across. However, the tube was, maybe miles, like it was massive. And as I looked to my right in the ceremony, that's where color was. And it was, orange, yellow, reds. And as I slowly turned my vision in front of me, the colors would slowly fade out. It was like a checkered pattern. And it would slowly fade out to grays and blacks. And then as I looked to the left, it would fade out completely to darkness. And the first time I had experienced this, I was freaking out. The story was, I am done. And this is where that story of spiritually, I'm done. Spiritually, I'm on the other side. Once I'm done physically, spirit is done with me, God is done with me, because I looked down that tube and what I saw was oblivion, death, spiritually. And so I was sitting in the center of this tube and struggling. And if you want to talk about hell, I don't believe there's an actual fire and brimstone place. I do believe it is a level of consciousness. I've definitely experienced it in that space because it literally was a looping thoughts of regret, shame, and guilt, just constant for hours. And in the medicine, if you've ever experienced it, time is irrelevant. So it felt like eternity. And it just kept going. I would get into a moment of guilt and sit there, and then shame, and then regret. And there'd be a moment of like, I feel like I'm power. No, I'm going to get through this. And I feel like my power's coming back, and then wham, I'm back down. And I just kept going through this loop. Now, as a disclaimer, this is not the experience of ayahuasca or plant medicine for everybody. It's unique to you. So I just want to be clear not to scare you away from it, and also I'm not recommending it, okay? Because it is something that is a very deep internal process. If you feel a calling for it, you will know. You'll start questioning, you'll start researching, you'll feel a pull of something that you want to explore. I just want to let you know that that experience is not something that is going to happen. That was my personal experience, okay? And so that was about 3 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. And so I wouldn't go back. Like, I definitely had PTSD from that experience. And I would go back and support to help set up, facilitate, the organization of the room, get everything set up. And then I would leave. I wouldn't sit in the ceremony. And I remember the first time I came back to help set up, I would do a light check because it's done in the dark. And when I turned off the lights, instantly my heart panic attack, like it was intense. Like I had to get out of the room. It was that previous ceremony experience was that intense that it was affecting me for months after. And looking back now, being in that negotiation and anger space was magnified because the emotions for me of shame, guilt, regret were coming up, and I wasn't allowing them to release because I was attaching my story. And I talk about this in the previous episode, and such that I would get caught in the loops versus learning to be the observer and surrendering to the experience and allowing those things to pass through me. And so, fast forward a few years, this was last May, and the individual that I was working with in the ceremonies that has been putting them together is done. Like, he's retired, and it was his last ceremony. So I decided I will go as a thank you and just to sit in one last time. And it was interesting. My come from with this was, I'm not looking for anything specific. I don't care, because my previous ones, again, going to the denial, negotiation, I was kind of bouncing through those grief stages. I was hoping I can go there to the ceremony and it would fix me and reconnect me, and I'd have this lovely, beautiful experience again, and I get hit with something out of left field. This time it's like, if that's what comes up, that's what comes up. I'm done fighting it. Like, I'm just done. I have no energy. I've been in depression for the, 2 years after that very intense ceremony. And so when I went there, the medicine I took a lot less than I normally do, just to be in the ceremony and go through the process. And it was different this time because I was back in that tunnel. And this time I wasn't scared of, like, fearful of the dark space, because I was, thinking that was oblivion. And so this time I looked into the dark space and was staring in there. And then I started seeing movement. I started seeing things moving in the dark space. And I realized, oh, there is something else there. From this position originally, I was too scared to look enough to move through that process, that I was staying stuck and therefore unable to move forward in my life. So if I were to translate being in that tube, I was stuck in moving through that grieving death process, death rebirth process, going through that darkness to come out the other side because I was so scared. And this was all great and shiny and fun and cool. However, with that, I was attaching a lot of poor behaviors, beliefs, etc. And so I was pausing myself here, unwilling to go here because of the fear, and unable to go back here because I have to move forward to grow. So I was stuck. And so this last time in May, I had went through and I surrendered. Like I said, I had no intention of a certain experience. I'm not doing this to connect to God, none of that. This is where I am. And as I went through that tunnel, I started to see other things and movement again and different things. The color wasn't as vivid. The colors weren't as bright as I have had experienced in the past. However, I started to move forward. And when I shared that in the experience, that in the sharing circle the next day, this is where my mentor had shared with me about the grieving process. And he had said, this sounds like you finally have come to acceptance. So I've been grieving for the 3.5-ish years of a version of myself that is no longer sufficient for my authentic living. And at the time, I didn't see that. I couldn't see that. And maybe you're not able to see that at this time either, right? And so my suggestion is, if you're recognizing you're in a space of denial or in a space of negotiation and some anger, and maybe dipping, maybe because it kind of goes, you swing around a little bit, at least in my experience, you may be going through a process of grieving, and it may be a relationship, it may be a business or a job or family member or all of those combined. On a deeper level, it may be an old self that is no longer relevant for your highest and greatest good. So for me, a lot of my distractions, like I mentioned in another episode, was social media and video game. And I would say in the last month, about 2 months, there was a point where I just said, I put a cut to video games and got rid of them all, deleted them all. I think total play time I've had in the last month is maybe about 10-15 minutes, which is crazy for me, right? And so I made a decision that behavior, the guy that would go and play video games when things would get too tough, too overwhelming mentally or emotionally, I would go to the video game to distract myself such that I don't have to deal with the things that are overwhelming. I decided to take that behavior out and commit not to go there. So through that process, I've learned to find more time to start actually doing the things that I want to do or say I will do. And I'm starting to move my life forward again, right? And so you may not be there, and that's totally fine. This is a process you are unable to push forward. It lasts as long as it needs to, and we have no choice in that process. Because it's like spirit, source, God, whatever you want to call it for yourself, is cleaning house, and it's going to clean house and make sure it's perfectly clean within, right? Because of that, we're not able to force it. The only thing we can do is essentially ride the tiger. And that's a Carl Jung quote. In riding this tiger, riding these waves of going down in these dips and then coming up feeling good, getting a breath of fresh air for a day, 2, maybe a week, and then back under for a day, 2, maybe a couple weeks. It's a matter of learning to surrender into this process and allow what needs to come up out. And the beauty of it is a deep cleansing process. For me personally, I would look at my need to be liked. That was something that I carried a lot around. I needed to be liked, or I needed to look good. And so in that, rejection was a challenge that I had in my life. I would be challenged with going out, putting myself out there, and, whether it's for business, whether for its work, any of those things, if I was rejected, I would reflect back. I'm not good enough. I'm not liked. What was it about me? And I'd really take it on such that I started to pull myself back, and my confidence started to go down. However, as I started to inch out step by step, moment by moment, I started recognizing that my fear of rejection is not there. And part of this dark process, this shadow space, dark night of the soul, whatever it is for you, it like I said in my last video, that it's where you find your power. And one of the things I recognize, this fear of rejection for myself, because I believed at a time, or thought at a time, that I was rejected by God, and the pain that someone can bring having that belief fully engaged and fully felt and experienced. There's not much outside of me that can reject me that will hurt more. So yes, it sucked experiencing that. However, part of alchemy and transmutation is taking a perceived negative and transmuting it into a positive. And so for me, that feeling of rejection from God, source, or spirit has transmuted into a space of, I can present myself and have no fear of rejection because I feel like I've been rejected by the Most High. And so it's kind of like a superpower. It's a shift in my perspective. And these little gifts, and these strengths will come out of this dark space. Most of the things we are challenged with in life bear the best and greatest fruits. And so this grieving process and experiencing this grief is a hollowing out. It's cleaning out such that it can be filled with more of your authentic self. Because if we have an ego of, I need to look a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain way for somebody else, for work, for people, for whatever, unfortunately, we're out of alignment. And that is going to lead us down paths to reflect back to us and create more situations and events that do reflect back to us these experiences to clean house. So this grieving process is the process of letting go of that version of you that isn't in service to your highest and authentic self. It's inauthentic. And those beliefs are coming from, your parents when you're 3 years old. It could be past lives. It could be when you're a teenager. They're outdated formats of thinking that we've been utilizing for years. And so, yes, it hurts when they come out because they've been a warm blanket and they did serve at a time and they were useful at a time. However, where you are at now, it may not be working anymore. And it's time to, I'm going to change that, the opportunity to let it go. And that is the hardest part, is letting things go, because we feel it's unknown. We don't know what's on the other side. And so when we're going through this process of grieving ourselves, we don't know who the new version is yet. And we have the old version that we're no longer able to go back to. Kind of like me being in that tube in my ceremony. An old version of me, what I perceived as the oblivion, absolute death, no new identity or who or what will come out on the other side. And I could stay stuck there and nothing happens, or I can let go and begin to move forward and go through the remainder of my process. And since I'd done that since May, that's when things in my life started really taking a step forward. So I will always say this: if you are experiencing challenge in your life, I'm here to say, I get it. I hear you. You are heard. You're not alone. And to keep going, even if it's one more day, just to keep going, showing up as best as you possibly can. And I know sometimes the best you possibly can is getting out of the bed, going to the bathroom, and going back to bed and just laying there. If that's the best you can do today, that's the best you can do today. And that's okay. You're in a process of healing. You're in a process of cleaning house internally. It is painful. It sucks. It is hell. And it will get better. And that's why I'm here. So if you are finding value here, please like, share, comment, to get the word out. And as always, no matter how dark it seems to get, even the smallest of embers can light your path. And my hope is this podcast becomes an ember on your path. With that, much love.